It is a great pleasure and indeed honor to welcome Douglas Cairns, professor at the University of Edinburgh and this year's guest professor at the Zurich Center for the Study of the Ancient World, the ZAZH. But speaking of honor, no one could answer the question, what is honor, better tonight than the guest speaker himself? After all, the topic of tonight's lecture comes from a field of research for which our guest was awarded an ERC grant of £1.8 million a few years ago for his work on honor in classical Greece. From 2018 to 2023, together with his strongly interdisciplinary team, he explored the various aspects and meanings of the Greek word timē and the relevance of the concept of honor in the present day and in everyday life, thus linking the ancient world and the contemporary world. We know this from the playground of our own childhood in primary school. Questions of honor and dishonor are already being discussed there. It's not without reason that words such as Ehre bro or Ehrelos, du bist ehrelos, have repeatedly been nominated as youth words of the year. So, and I quote from the project's website, the ERC project, however, corrects misleading ideas that understand honor as a monolithic notion, especially associated with zero-sum competition between alpha males. Instead, it looks at timē as pluralistic, inclusive, and flexible notion as it pervaded ancient Greek literature, thought, and society, from the heroic epic to Athenian democracy and beyond. Overall, it refers to ancient values of justice, friendship, and social solidarity, as much as it does to the violence of heroic self-assertion and the pursuit of vengeance. I'd like to mention a new publication by Douglas Cairns on the notion of hybris, which will be released soon. We cannot wait to read this book, and as you all know, Christmas is coming soon. The theme of honor runs like a thread through Douglas Cairns' work, beginning with his groundbreaking study Eidos, the psychology and ethics of honor and shame in ancient Greek literature, published in 1993. It was originally the subject of his doctoral thesis at the University of Glasgow, his hometown. In this book, Douglas Cairns firmly links the emotion of eidos, which covers both shame and embarrassment, to questions of honor. And linking especially, he looks at ancient texts that link the shame of losing one's own honor and respect with the respect for the honor of others. Eidos is part of an internalized code that affects oneself and others. So Douglas Cairns has shown that it is misleading to separate shame and guilt cultures and to portray Greek culture as being dominated solely by outward-focused or non-internalized shame. With his book on eidos, Douglas Cairns has introduced the paradigm of historical emotion research into classics, a topic that he established as a productive area of research in the years that have followed. So it's fitting that he has come to Zurich to conclude the annual theme of emotions, mithassen, mitfühlen, antike Gefühlswelten aus moderner Perspektive here at ZAZH. Just as his other areas of research, this topic demonstrates his interdisciplinary approach to antiquity, drawing innovatively on psychology, sociology, and cognitive science. At the same time, he has always linked these questions to ancient texts. Douglas Cairns, who holds the chair of classics at Edinburgh since 2004, has thus opened new ways of understanding ancient literature and society. So it would be too much to list his monographs, including those on Sophocles and Bacchylides, his numerous edited books, his articles, visiting professorships in Japan, Taiwan, and finally here in Zurich, and his project grants, such as the ERC Oxford project on the social and cultural construction of emotions in 2012 and 13. What I would like to focus on, in conclusion, is what fascinates me much about Douglas Cairns and what I myself experienced as a participant of this year's Celtic Conference in Classics in Coimbra, the CCCC. Douglas co-founded this conference format over 25 years ago. And since then it has taken place in various countries such as Canada, France, Portugal, and Ireland, where it will, I think, return next time. Douglas Cairns contributed from the outset to this undertaking, which brings together hundreds and hundreds of classicists and scholars of the classical world, together with the aim of shifting attention from large, renowned universities to lesser known and regional ones, and in order to strengthen collaboration between distant academic institutions. So, as an organizer of academic events, Douglas Cairns has a particular talent for bringing people together and inspiring them. And we are very much looking forward to the upcoming days where he will be teaching a seminar, a block seminar, together with our students on the history of emotions and on group emotions as well. He's also a team player when it comes to his actual hobby, music, as he has revealed to me today. You can not only discuss with him about Portuguese fado, but also about country music. And this fun fact is a must to mention. He plays double bass in a bluegrass band. But we are delighted, Douglas, that you are honoring us today with your equally wonderful second hobby, classics. And we look forward to your presentation. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. So thank you very, very much indeed, Markus, for the really very nice introduction. So often people just read out your website, which is kind of embarrassing, but Markus actually went to the trouble of thinking about who I was and what I had done over the years. It's always very embarrassing to listen to these introductions, but it's even worse when they give away the entire subject of your lecture. So everything that Markus said is in the lecture. I might as well just show you the slides and we can go to the restaurant early. So it's true. I mean, I have been working on these things for a long time. And I've said all the things that Markus says that I've said many times over, as we say in English, until I am blue in the face. But it doesn't really seem to make that much difference. So honor is a topic that I think is still very poorly understood. So there's a lot written about it in classics, classical studies, a lot written about it in other disciplines, but a lot of it is not very helpful. So the purpose of this project that you see here, and I'll show you its website here, since 2018, has been to remedy this deficiency. So to try and understand honor, in particular as it affects classical Greece, in a different way, in a way that reflects some of the useful findings of other disciplines beyond classics, beyond the humanities. So we've been working, as Markus said, towards a complete reassessment of what it is we talk about when we talk about honor in classical Greek society. So what I'm going to do this evening is just give you a broad outline of what we have been saying and thinking and discussing with each other for the past 6 or 7 years or so. The books are on their way. There's a book on honor in Aristotle coming out in January by one of our postdocs, and the various other volumes will follow. These things always take much longer than you think they're going to take. The hubris one is out next week, though, if you do want to fill a stocking with that. So a typical and serious failing of scholarship on the notion of honor is, again, as Markus indicated, to put the phenomenon in a ghetto. So this is the idea that honor is something limited only to some forms of interaction between people, so found in some contexts of life, but not in others. Or to ghettoize it as a concern only of one social stratum among many, or to ghettoize it as typically masculine, or as characteristic of only some forms of social organization, so only aristocratic societies, only inner city gangs, and so on. So assumptions of this sort feed formulations such as this one by Sheda Novin and Hafner Oyserman. So this is a relatively recent article in which they say that in honor societies, what others think matters, and vigilant attention to the possibility of losing face or losing respect is necessary. In dignity societies, others are de-emphasized, and what matters is one's own norms, values, and beliefs. So you'll recognize that Markus mentioned that kind of approach. It's relatively widespread. At one time, I think probably the paradigm for these kind of honor societies might have been the Mediterranean, including the ancient Mediterranean, but more recently it has really become the southern states of the United States. And these characterizations of honor societies, these are societies in which people get very angry if you disrespect them, allegedly. These bear clear comparison with the antithesis that was once fashionable between shame cultures and guilt cultures. So some of us, such as myself and the much better known Bernard Williams, we hoped that these things had been consigned to history some 30 years ago, but sadly this is not the case. With both of these antitheses, honor societies versus dignity societies, and shame cultures versus guilt cultures, the fundamental problem isn't so much identifying honor societies or shame cultures. We can go into the playground, we can go out into the street, and we can identify those. The real problem is in finding examples of their supposed counterparts, societies in which others are de-emphasized and what matters is one's own norms, values, and beliefs. Because there's no society in which norms, values, and beliefs arise in a social vacuum, arise by themselves without interaction with other people. Clearly, a person can develop a reflective and personal system of values and beliefs, and that could be fundamental to their sense of their self and their character, but the development of any belief system of that sort, or any sort, is inevitably intersubjective between people and inevitably social. Dignity is impossible without self-esteem, but self-esteem and self-respect are formed in the interaction between our esteem and respect for our others and their esteem and respect for us. You can't have self-esteem without the esteem of others. So dignity must be acquired and must be performed in a social context. This is a slide that those who come to the seminars will see again and again over the next few days. We'll talk about the ideas contained here quite a lot. But the point about the work of Andy Meltzoff and Michael Moore and Colwyn Trevarthen, and then more recently Michael Tomasello and Sean Gallagher, these are much more wide-ranging books, but they do build in this approach to early developmental psychology. The point of all this work is that all human beings, from the earliest stages of life, live in a world in which their identity, their sense of self, and their claims to recognition by others are constituted intersubjectively and interactively developed in interaction with other people, in an expanding circle of social contexts and relationships. So the distinction that underpins antitheses such as honor versus dignity societies and shame versus guilt cultures is essentially one between two sorts of value, between values that are intrinsic and values that are extrinsic in their orientation. And there's good work on intrinsic and extrinsic values. So in principle, these are valid and useful categories for the analysis of behavior and beliefs, both of individuals and of groups, of whole societies. These ideas of intrinsic and extrinsic values also have a degree of utility in measuring differences between groups, societies, and cultures, including historical change over time, changes in social, political, and economic circumstances. So societies don't stand still in the respect in which they promote one of these categories over the other. So the poles of the antithesis here are represented on the one hand by values to which people are deeply committed, even when material success and social approval might pull them in a different direction. So these are the intrinsic values. And on the other hand, you have values that are fundamentally oriented towards material rewards and social approval. These are the extrinsic ones. And there's an argument that contemporary first world societies like ours, maybe more so Switzerland than Scotland, we are sinking down into the third world, I think, sometimes. But there is an argument that societies of that sort, since the days of Thatcher and Reagan, and the gradual erosion of the post-war consensus, are increasingly dominated by individuals whose values are excessively extrinsic in their orientation. They're more concerned with external factors. So, according to the former British Foreign Secretary, Lord David Owen, the current President of the United States is not only very interested in money, but widely regarded as a narcissist. A close analogue in the United Kingdom, as this report outlines, the report at the top there, had to resign from the office of Prime Minister when it became apparent that he and his administration were much, much more concerned about creating an illusion of ethical behavior than in adhering to the substance of ethical behavior. So he lost power when the lies that he told, and I can say lies without fear of being sued because that's what this report at the top right-hand corner there tells us, the lies that he told to maintain a facade of public respectability only served to illustrate the contempt that he and his administration had for shared ethical norms and for their fellow citizens who expected them to live by those norms. But we can't assume that even individuals whose values are excessively extrinsic in orientation have no intrinsic values whatsoever. And even in contemporary first world societies that are obsessed with consumerism, materialism, with image and celebrity, it isn't the case that these values escape censure, and it isn't the case either that they are endorsed by all people at all times. So the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic values is useful for analyzing the ways in which individuals and groups tend more in one direction than in another. The extent to which changes and differences in socioeconomic structure foster different mixtures at different periods is certainly a legitimate object of sociological and historical inquiry, but there is no group and no historical society, and perhaps even no individual either, except in extreme pathological cases, in which we don't find some combination of both of these tendencies towards the intrinsic and the extrinsic. Despite strong reasons for believing that contemporary Western societies, and especially their elites, are subject to an ever stronger pull in the direction of extrinsic values, the paradox is that educated elites within those societies have used and continue to use labels such as shame culture and honor society to denigrate and patronize internal and external others. So this is when we get the notion of honor societies or shame cultures applied to inner city teenagers, to immigrants of various origins, to citizens of the southern states of the United States and their Scottish ancestors, to Native Americans, to the Japanese, to Southern Europeans, to North Africans, to Indians, Pakistanis, and Muslims, and, of course, to the ancient Greeks. Now, it's possible to pursue praise and esteem as ends in themselves, just to want to be praised, just to want to be liked. And it's possible to do that without any commitment to developing or manifesting the qualities for which you are praised or esteemed. But the point is, that would be a pathological perversion of the normal pattern, in which people prize and try genuinely to manifest the qualities, the good qualities, for which they want to be praised and respected. So if you were wondering when the classics comes in, this is it now. So as Aristotle reminds us very simply in Book 1 of the Rhetoric, it's pleasant to be admired and pleasant to be honoured, but for him, importantly, this pleasure is not an end in itself, as we see in this passage from Book 8 of the Ethics. So for some people, as Aristotle is saying here, esteem, honour, is simply a means to the advancement of some further end. So we want to be esteemed by important people because we think that important people might be useful to us at some stage. But Aristotle goes on to say that there are other people for whom esteem is about seeking well-informed confirmation of their own view of themselves. So for them, the pleasure of being esteemed isn't just in the fact that other people think they're great, it's in the fact that they think they might be great, and it's being validated by the opinion of others. So the pleasure lies in trusting the judgment of those who say that we are good. And as Aristotle repeatedly notes, this is precisely why people look for the esteem of others. They do it in order to confirm their own sense of themselves as, in some sense, good people. So lots of passages say that, and Aristotle sums it up in chapter 1.5 of the Ethics by saying that honour is essentially the goal of life in a political community. So on this view, esteem validates and enhances self-esteem. And consistently, Aristotle sees honour, the Greek word time, and Aristotle understands time in a slightly reduced, less inclusive sense. He sees time typically in terms of the esteem that we receive from others. We'll talk a little bit later on about how this isn't the only sense. But Aristotle sees esteem or honour as something that confirms our own positive view of ourselves. So the value of time is not just about being popular and not just about being praised. It's about confirming our sense of ourselves as people who actually do possess the qualities that we value and that we want to see valued in us by others. My fellow Glasgow graduate, Adam Smith, puts it very similarly in saying that it's a matter of wanting to be praiseworthy, not just to be praised. It's about wanting to be respectable as well as respected. You want to be worthy of the respect that you receive. So for Adam Smith, this is a fundamental aspect of human sociality. More recently, much more recently, the literary scholar Alexander Sandy Welsh has emphasized the need to demystify honour and treat it as one kind of motivation that all are subject to. And on the same slide, we have the study of the economist Geoffrey Brennan and the philosopher Philip Pettit, which dismisses as a grievous error the common assumption that concern for honour or esteem is found only in small-scale face-to-face societies, or the idea that it's purely aristocratic, or that it's a feature only of marginalised countercultural groups. This is a pool to which all are subject, according to Welsh and to Brennan and Pettit. So different individuals, different groups and societies care about others' esteem for different reasons. The qualities for which one is esteemed may vary very widely. The qualities that you need to manifest to get esteem may differ, but none of these differences entails a distinction between some societies in which individuals want to see their self-image validated and other societies in which they don't want to see their self-image validated. Aristotle is not an outlier in this respect. Aristotle's typical in this respect. So in his fictional dialogue, between the Sicilian tyrant Hieron and the lyric poet Simonides, Xenophon has Hieron draw a strong distinction between respect and fear, esteem and flattery, and this distinction emphasizes the relation between respect, esteem, and self-esteem. So according to Hieron, the tyrant can never be sure that praise is sincere or genuine. So where Simonides argues that tyrants enjoy obedience, deference, respect, and admiration in the highest degree, and so they benefit from the greatest of human pleasures, as he says, they enjoy the esteem of their fellow creatures, Hieron observes that deference that's coerced through fear is not deference at all. So when people are respectful towards you because they're afraid of you, all that's being reflected is the extreme imbalance in power between, let's say, a tyrant and his subjects. Hieron says genuine marks of esteem and respect, genuine timai, are different from that. They indicate sincere appreciation of the qualities and actions in their recipients that benefit others and show genuine regard for the recipient's well-being. So when you honor someone, it's because you think they are good, but you also think they're good for you, and so you, in effect, are setting the standard to which they must aspire. So the tyrant, like any other normal human being, doesn't just want to hear nice things about himself. He wants people sincerely to believe that these nice things are true. He doesn't just want flattery. He doesn't want praise that has no substance behind it. He wants genuine praise, genuine esteem, and genuine respect. And if that's the case, then what the tyrant wants, like everyone else, isn't just praise, it's validation. These links between esteem and self-esteem, which in fact highlight the complementarity and the interdependence of honor and dignity, because that's what this is about. It's about honor being given by others and the dignity that one wishes to see validated by others. These links receive powerful ancient support also in a text that you may or may not be familiar with, an anonymous late or early 5th or early 4th century text, preserved at least in part in the Protrepticus of Iamblichus, the anonymous Iamblichi. So as it's excerpted in what we have of it, the text begins with the topic of excellence or virtue, arete. And it says it's hard to achieve arete. But then quickly in the second fragment turns to reputation, to doxa. And it says, just as it takes a long time to achieve arete, so you have to start out young and behave consistently for the rest of your life if you're going to acquire doxa. And it's only then, after much time has passed, and you've repeatedly shown yourself to be a person of a certain sort, only then will people believe that you are what you seem to be. We'll break this passage down, don't worry. So this is partly because people are reluctant to praise. People don't find it pleasant to honor other people. They think they're losing something if they acknowledge that someone else is praiseworthy. So they find it uncongenial to honor others because they take a quasi-zero-sum view. If I praise you, then I am somehow losing something that I value myself. But it's also a matter of caution. They don't want to build up your reputation as a good person in case you're not a good person. So they're worried also about being deceived. It's a matter of trust. So doubts about the accuracy of your reputation and the malicious envy, I see Anthony at the back, the malicious phronos that makes people reluctant to praise, and the fear of being deceived, these are all dispelled only if you can consistently demonstrate that you actually have the qualities on which your reputation rests. And so the process of building a reputation is simultaneously a process of developing virtue. He's arguing that you don't get the reputation unless you actually have the qualities for which the reputation exists. So he says that virtue creates both trust and reputation at the same time, in an environment, as we've seen already, in which neither of these things is readily granted. No one is going to say you're good on the basis of a few indications. No one is going to trust your reputation if they are afraid that at some stage you will turn on them and deceive them. So this is a selective environmental pressure, and a strong pressure to be what you seem to be. So time, honor, is not something that people confer indiscriminately. They need to be convinced that an individual actually has the qualities that deserve it. People have absolutely no interest in encouraging you to seem good rather than being good. And they're constantly on guard for the possibility that you may just be putting it on. You may be trying to show that you're a good person when in fact you're not. So there's the vigilant attention that Oysen and Novin and Oyserman talked about. So an individual's fellow citizens are acutely sensitive to social comparison. The things that we want, recognition and esteem, are also things that they want for themselves too. And the author here believes that people will recognize others' qualities when it becomes undeniable that they actually do possess those qualities. That may be too optimistic, but even if it is, it's clear that actually possessing the qualities you claim to possess substantially improves your chances of getting recognition and esteem for those qualities. And so the distinction between honor societies and dignity societies is based on a false antithesis. Intrinsic and extrinsic values, things that are interconnected and mutually reinforcing, are central to all human societies, including those of the ancient Greeks, though the content of those values is, of course, subject to considerable cultural variation and considerable historical change. The ancient Greek time is, in fact, a reflex of a general human concern for esteem, validation, respect, and recognition. Though the range of the English language term honor, or I think the German term Ehre, has become reduced and etiolated, still a concern for honor isn't typical only of a certain type of society, only a rare self-contained society that's obsessed with extrinsic values to the exclusion of the intrinsic ones. Now, of course, this distinction between honor societies and dignity societies doesn't arise from nowhere. In particular, it arises out of the shame culture, guilt culture antithesis, and these are its proponents. So Franz Boas and his pupils Ruth Benedict, her pupil Margaret Mead. So the shame culture, guilt culture antithesis worked, at least in some of its simpler forms, with a similar contrast between societies whose norms depend on external versus internal sanctions. The classicist, Arthur Adkins, preferred the label results culture to shame culture, but he meant the same thing by it. He still believed that in a result culture, like the one that we allegedly find in the Homeric poems, the individual cannot fall back, this is a quotation, upon his own opinion of himself, for his self only has the value which other people put on it. And the great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, in a 1965 volume that's become seminal for approaches to honor in classical studies, once espoused a similar view, saying that the point of honor is the basis of a moral code of an individual who sees himself always through the eyes of another, who has need of others for his existence, because the image he has of himself is indistinguishable from that presented to him by other people. But if the image we have of ourselves was indistinguishable from that presented to us by other people, the only possible attitude towards losing face or losing respect wouldn't be vigilant attention, as we see here, because I would have nothing to be vigilant about. If they say I'm worthless and my idea of myself is identical to theirs, then I am worthless. So why should I pay vigilant attention? Why should I get angry? The only possible attitude, if Bourdieu was right and if Atkins was right, would be acquiescence. If my self-image is identical to you, the image you have of me, then I have no complaint when the image you have of me differs from the one I have of myself. The fact that individuals in any society do in fact guard against loss of face and react defensively or angrily when they're seriously threatened with disrespect shows that scenarios of that kind depend on a discrepancy between a person's image in their own eyes and the image presented to them by others. This is what anger is all about. Maintaining face, as Irving Goffman long ago demonstrated, and Gloria Origi has now, I think, confirmed in her wonderful book on reputation as our second identity, as Gloria puts it. Maintaining face is in all societies a matter of negotiation, interactive negotiation between our own self-presentation, the reception of our self-presentation by other people, and our own reception of other people's self-presentation. So Goffman talks about demeanor, how we present ourselves. And your demeanor, he says, projects and protects your face. He takes this term from Eastern societies. And in doing so, you take a certain line. You're presenting yourself in a certain way, in a certain direction, but this is always in a context in which you have to pay attention at the same time to the people whom you want to accept your line and protect your face. So if I'm concerned for my face, if I want my line to be endorsed by you in an interaction, then it can't all just be about me, me, me. I have to be, at some level, concerned also with you. I have to pay attention to your face and your line. So according to Goffman, and I think he's right, social interaction involves continuous bidirectional monitoring of how I'm doing and how the other person is doing. You monitor your own demeanor and the other person's deference, and you monitor your own deference and the other person's demeanor. So the social world that this presupposes isn't one in which the self only has the value which other people place on it, as Atkins would have it. It's rather one in which, as Goffman puts it, the individual must rely on others to complete the picture of him, of which he himself is allowed to paint only certain parts. So we can't make up our social identity all by ourselves. It needs the endorsement of other people. And the interactive nature of these processes is highlighted in that text I mentioned already by the anonymous Jamblichie. The community or group on whose evaluation honour depends has a strong interest in determining what excellence consists in. But the selective pressure exerted by the social environment is also complemented by the aims and the needs of the individual. It's assumed that reputation is something that any rational person would want, just as malicious envy, phonos, is not just the opposite of reputation, but something that everyone would want to avoid. But as in Aristotle, as in Xenophon's Hiero, and as in Adam Smith, people value reputation not for its own sake, but in order that the qualities they possess and value should be recognized and valued by others, as we've seen already. So just as trust is the absence of doubt that other people are as they seem to be, so the pursuit of reputation is at the same time the desire to be recognized as the kind of person you really are. This is not a matter of just conforming to other people's expectations. It's not about heteronomy over autonomy. As the author emphasizes himself in fragment 4, a truly good person pursues reputation not by putting it on like a jacket, not by just assuming an outward appearance of virtue, putting on a jacket that belongs to someone else. They do it by means of their own excellence, he says. So such a person wants to be praiseworthy rather than merely praised, wants to be respectable as well as respected. Reputation, trust, and virtue are all co-created at the same time in ways that allow us to manifest the qualities that we value and that are valued by our communities. This means that contrary to what is sometimes asserted, the role of the community or the group on whose evaluation honour depends and in whose gift honour resides isn't simply that of an audience or an umpire. So the community isn't simply adjudicating between rival claims to excellence. So this is something that the Hülkeskamps take from Georg Simmel, but Simmel is explicitly talking about competition. Honour isn't just about competition. So it's much more the case that the community is actually an active participant in its own right. The community has strong interests in determining what counts as excellence. The community will reward you with its esteem only if your behavior aligns with the community's values. So the community there isn't just an audience, it's a player. Excellencies that are rewarded with social esteem cannot be excellencies that serve our interests alone, our interests in competition with others. To be validated by the community, they have to serve the community's interests as well. And this is another theme that's recurrent in ancient theorizations of honour. So for Aristotle in the Rhetoric, again, Book 1, Chapter 5, honour, time again, is defined as a sign of a positive reputation for doing good or for benefaction, beneficence. So people are honoured for what they do for others or what they can do for others, says Aristotle. And some of the examples that Aristotle gives there of honours indicate that he's clearly thinking of large-scale public benefactions and public honours. So when he talks about grants of land, prohedria, statues, maintenance at the state expense, and so on, he's thinking about benefiting the polis and therefore being honoured by the polis. You notice that's a dyadic relationship between two individuals. But some of the other things he mentions are purely interpersonal. So he talks about gifts, for example. He talks about making way for other people. So it's those more informal types of deference or benefaction that are in the forefront in this passage in Xenophon's Hiero, which we've looked at before, in which the tyrant contrasts the servile performances of those who have to be coerced to show respect with the freely given honours, including purely personal expressions such as standing up as a mark of respect on the part of those who respond to their benefactors in friendship and not in fear. So we're beginning to see that honour in Greek societies, as theorized by Xenophon, the Anonymous Iamblichi, and Aristotle, has an awful lot to do with cooperation, coherence, trust, and philia, friendship. The fullest and most nuanced expression of this is once again in the Anonymous Iamblichi. So for him too, excellencies are qualities of individuals, but the performance requires using them for the benefit of others, for good ends. And we do this to the fullest extent, he says, if we benefit the greatest number, in a quasi-utilitarian formulation, although it's very far from utilitarian. So we do this, we benefit the greatest number, not by giving them our cash, not by philanthropy in that sense, in the modern sense, but by supporting law and justice. Because supporting law and justice is what allows us to contribute to eunomia, to what holds cities and people together. The development of individual virtue, in tandem with the acquisition of social esteem, doesn't just serve the interests of the individual. It creates a condition of eunomia that benefits communities and all their members. So this is the counterpoint of the argument in the second fragment of this treatise, where the community, in its own interests, exercises significant selective pressure on the development of the qualities it values, qualities that it rewards with honor and reputation. In this passage, the virtue that reputation rewards lies in acting in the interests of the greatest number of your fellow citizens. So this means that though it's possible to regard the community as an audience of interactions between typically elite individuals, even in that scenario, the role of the community isn't limited to simply adjudicating between those individuals' claims. Even in that situation, the community is a player. But it's also characteristic of classical Athenian thought in this area to make the community not so much one participant in a three-way relation as an audience or umpire of interactions between individuals, but to make it much more an interactant in one-to-one relationships in its own right. And this is the logic of the Athenian system, of euergetism, of public honors. It's the logic of euergetism more widely considered, conceived as a relationship of reciprocity, charis, between the individual and the community. But that logic also holds good in purely interpersonal dyadic relationships. Let's go back to Norvin and Oyserman again. So that quotation, the one we started with, foregrounds individuals in honor societies paying vigilant attention to what other people think. And this presupposes not absolute heteronomy, but an aspiration that our own sense of ourselves should be validated by others. So there are personally endorsed standards there. We've established that, I think. But you notice the vigilant attention that they talk about is said to be focused on two things. It's focused not only on the possibility of losing face, it's also focused on the danger of losing respect. Novin and Oyserman frame the contrast solely in terms of an individual and their needs, and this individual's orientation towards extrinsic or intrinsic values. But even if we just concern ourselves with the dynamics of honor as they describe them in their own antithesis, we can still see that there's a lot more involved than just the aims of the individual preoccupied with others' opinion. So the individual that they have in mind here not only seeks esteem and wants to avoid disesteem in the eyes of an audience, but that individual also projects a self-image that they hope to see validated. So what that individual wants in that scenario is what Stephen Darwell, the Kantian philosopher, calls appraisal respect. They're looking for their excellencies to be appraised as positive by other people. This matters to that individual as an individual, and it depends on the individual's own idea of what counts as excellence. So I don't want to be, there's a brilliant passage in William James about this. If I'm a psychologist, he says, I don't want to be valued for my prowess in ancient Greek. If I'm an expert in ancient Greek, I don't care about my absence of prowess in psychology. You want to be valued for being good at the things that you yourself want to be good at. So this matters to you because you have your own idea of what matters. But the validation of that depends on the extent to which the idea of excellence that I have of myself is endorsed and promoted by the audience. So it's not just about individuals getting things from others. It's about interaction between the values of the individual and the values of the group. And in that interaction, both of these parties have important roles to play. So that's appraisal respect. In paying attention to the other thing that Noven and Oyserman mentioned, the danger of losing respect, on the other hand, the individual isn't performing some form of excellence before an audience. The individual is in fact exerting a claim to what Darwall calls recognition respect. So the difference between appraisal and recognition respect is that we cannot help but recognize that there's a claim to be responded to in a particular situation. We have to, as he says, factor it into our deliberations. So, for example, I can think that Roger Federer is a great tennis player, but he doesn't care whether I think that or not, and I don't have to tell him. If Roger Federer came into my cafe and wanted to buy a coffee and I ignored him, then I would be doing him disrespect, because he has a legitimate expectation that as a customer, and he walks into a cafe, he has a right to be served. So in recognition respect, we have a claim that some aspect of the individual's worth, or dignity, if you like, should be recognized by another person. And this is fundamentally dyadic. It's fundamentally a feature of one-to-one interpersonal relationships. Noven and Oyserman's formulation is intended to center more or less entirely on an individual's dependence on others' approval. And yet, limited though it is, it presupposes multiple roles and multiple ways of dealing with honor. So not only seeking praise and esteem, but also giving praise and esteem. And not only seeking and giving esteem, appraisal respect, but also claiming and showing recognition respect, interpersonally, one-to-one. So the focus in that context of recognition respect is on a connection of reciprocity in which each party benefits from mutual recognition. And it's in this sense that time in Greek is fundamental to mutual, non-zero-sum, cooperative relationships of charis and philia. So this is why Xenophon's Hiero, in Xenophon's Hiero, Simonides counters Hieron's anxieties about the sincerity of others' respect by observing that genuine respect from others has to be fostered by our respect for them. If we do services for them, if we are their friends, they will be our friends. We honor others for the benefits they confer on us, but one of those benefits is itself honor, and mutual honoring benefits both parties mutually. So honor is also often described, as I'm sure you know, in terms of zero-sum forms of competition. This is the idea that if I do better, someone else has to do worse. If I achieve greater honor, I have to take it from someone else. And even where it's just about achieving appraisal respect, that is not necessarily an accurate model. But where we're talking about recognition respect, which has to be second personal, which has to be two-way, has to be mutual, then honor simply cannot possibly be zero-sum in nature. Mutual cooperation will not get off the ground if both parties end up where they started. It has to be better for them to cooperate than it would be not to cooperate. And that's the lesson of Robert Wright's book on non-zero. In his later writings, Stephen Darwall distinguishes not only between appraisal respect and recognition respect, but also between two varieties at least of recognition respect. So he distinguishes between genuinely, as he puts it, second personal recognition respect and what he calls honor respect. So honor respect meets the original conditions for recognition respect because it does consist in giving appropriate consideration or recognition to some feature of the object when you're deliberating about what to do. But it's not properly second personal, according to Darwall, insofar as it doesn't focus on the other person as a person, it focuses on the other person as the bearer of a role, as the holder of a certain status, as the possessor of a certain rank. So it's not about mutual accountability and equal authority or dignity, as Darwall puts it. Now, these are useful heuristic distinctions in a number of contexts, but the point I'd like to make is that none of those distinctions answers to anything in the explicit Greek conceptualization of time. So the Greek word time, the Greek concept of time, covers appraisal respect, recognition respect, and honor respect. The Greeks don't divide these things up. And the Greek terminology itself, in fact, highlights aspects of honor that the labels of other languages, such as English, often obscure. Because time isn't just a matter of the respect that the person receives from others or the esteem in which a person is held by others. The same term, time, also indicates the individual's own claims to recognition or esteem. So time can refer to the claim that a person wants to see endorsed, as well as to the endorsement itself, as well as to the recognition or esteem that a person receives. And we see this most clearly in cases in which time is a matter of the performance of a particular role. So a role may command other people's respect, and a role can be allocated to people as a mark of esteem, but this doesn't negate the fact that the term time can clearly designate the role itself and the prerogative that belongs with it. So I've given you an example here from poetry, from Homer, and that passage is about divine prerogatives, and it's very early and it's poetic, but it still illustrates the point perfectly. What Poseidon is talking about here when he says he's homotimos with Zeus and Hades is that they have all been allocated a sphere of operation, a role to perform, in which they should be left to perform that role without disrespect. So they have a claim to respect in that area. So Poseidon's time is about his positive freedom to exercise his prerogatives without interference. So it's about roles and prerogatives that entail claims to respect. So time can also be a matter of who the agent is and what the agent does, as well as of the ways in which an agent is respected or regarded by others. And this is the basic sense in which all Athenian citizens can be said to enjoy time insofar as they are citizens, and they do. So citizenship is a form of time. Citizenship allows you to do certain things. So that's about the respect that citizens receive from fellow citizens and non-citizens alike, but it's also about the things they can do, the prerogatives that they can exercise, the privileges they can exercise, and they're entitled to exercise as long as they remain citizens in good standing. And so we all know that in classical Athens, you could lose those prerogatives. You could be subject to atimia. So you forfeit the ability to do some of the things that a citizen can do, or all of the things that a citizen can do, if you fall short of the expected standards of performance. So it's on that basis that honor can be said to be, as Frank Henderson Stewart says it is, a claim right. So honor can be the source of a claim, an entitlement claim, a claim to recognition and respect. Your time is, in effect, your dignity, your claim to having your dignity recognized by others. And Greek terminology reflects this bidirectionality consistently. So in the same way, eidos can refer to two very different things as we see it. It can refer to the sense of shame that comes into play when our own honor is at stake. So eidos is what you feel when you feel that you're going to look bad in front of other people. So it could be loss of face, or it could be a failure to perform your obligations to others, as we see in this passage here from Iliad 22, a famous passage. So there Hector is concerned, he feels shame because of what other people will say about him, because he's fallen short in his obligations to them. And he's concerned very much about how he looks to others. He's concerned very much about the loss of esteem, which would make him ashamed. So clearly shame in this case. you notice that even in this example, what they will say about Hector is precisely what Hector says about himself. On the other hand, eidos regularly refers to the positive respect that other people are owed. So whether this is recognition respect proper or what Darwell calls honor respect, whether it's about rank or whether it's about obligation, it's still recognition respect. It's still respect. So here in the Doloneia and in Iliad 10, Agamemnon is saying, don't show any consideration for rank when you're choosing someone for the spying mission. Do not give way to eidos. And that's not about shame. That's about positive respect for another person's status. So that's the case with eidos. Hubris is the same. Hubris is a way of going wrong, not just about other people's claims to honor. It's not just about denying them the respect that they are due. It's also about having a false idea of your own claim to honor. You overstate your own claims and you underestimate the claims of other people, as Aristotle clearly says. So it's both about dishonoring other people, but it's also about the pleasure that you take in thinking that you yourself are superior. So it balances both sides of the interaction. So Greek terminology explicitly acknowledges the bidirectional interactive nature of the interplay of esteem, respect, self-esteem, and dignity that's characteristic of Goffman's approach to social interaction and characteristic also of Brown and Levenson's politeness theory, where it's all a matter of positive face that you project and negative face that you want to protect against the incursions of other people. It also encompasses the Hegelian insight, developed above all by Axel Honneth, that interpersonal recognition is fundamentally mutual in character. So it's not just that demanding recognition without ever granting it is impractical, atypical, and transgressive, although it is. You can't go around in the world demanding that people recognize you if you never recognize them. But it's much more importantly the fact that demanding recognition from someone else is, as Hegel and Honneth point out, a way of recognizing that person. So if I want you to respect me, I'm treating you as in some sense as a person like me, as a player in the same game as I am in. And so denying someone else recognition, if it's possible, I'm not sure that it is possible, but if you try to deny other people recognition, the recognition they deserve, then you're excluding those people from recognizing you. And this is Hegel's master-slave paradox. As I mentioned, developmental psychology also suggests that the roots of this mutual implication of the self and the other go back to the very earliest interactions between the infant and the primary caregiver, normally the mother. So we'll talk a lot about this, about the fact that for human beings, intersubjectivity begins at birth. We're not just hermetically closed off, selfish little agents from the word go. We're looking for the agency of others in order to develop our own sense of agency as soon as we're born. As Charles Taylor puts it, a self requires other selves. Self-presentation can take place only in a circumstance in which other selves are presented. And this bidirectional focus on the presentation of self and the presentation of the other is absolutely fundamental to human sociality. So all cultures have to calibrate that notion of self-worth, that's sometimes called dignity, not just against other people's willingness to validate its claims, but also against the need to show esteem for others and recognition of others. That is what honor is all about. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Douglas, for this impressive and illuminating talk. And you showed that honor or time is quite a pluralistic and inclusive notion or concept, not only for the ancient Greeks, but on and on. So I'm quite sure there are questions or remarks from the public. So the floor is open for anyone's questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. So if I understood correctly, you still maintain that there are different cultures that still have different tendencies in regard to extrinsic and intrinsic factors.
Different mixtures of tendencies, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So where are the ancient Greeks on that spectrum? Are they in the perfect middle, as always, or?
It's obviously an impossible question to answer, but there are obviously things we can say as well. So if you look at explicit formulations, so like the sort of thing Aristotle is prepared to say about honor, or the kind of thing that Xenophon is prepared to say about honor, and contrast that with the thing that Novin and Oyserman say about it, and the people who investigate the southern states of the United States, or the people who investigated the Mediterranean in the 60s, what they say about it. The ancient Greek conceptions are much less individualistic. So the modern formulations are all focalized from the point of view of an individual who wants things from others. And it's no accident, I think, that what you're talking about there is a form of utility. You're talking about homo economicus. You're talking about self-interested individuals pursuing their own self-interest in an environment where other people are simply resources for that self-interest. The ancient Greeks don't think that way. So notoriously, or famously, and I think rightly, Chris Gill has pointed to a difference between ancient Greek and modern Western European societies in terms of the latter being subjective individualist in orientation, and the ancient Greek being objective participant in orientation. So there's much more about us in ancient Greece than there is for us. And I think it's notable that although we can get to where Goffman gets, for example, or to where Honneth gets, or to where developmental psychology gets us, we can get to the idea that we are not simply atomistically separated individuals, that we exist fundamentally in relation to others, and that we have a sense of ourselves only through interaction with others. We can get to that conclusion. We can get to Goffman's picture of demeanor and deference being mutually implicated and never separable in any real interaction. But the thing is, the ancient Greek terminology of time, eidos, and hubris says that right up front. So even just to forget about time and hubris for a moment, think about eidos. The fact that it means both shame and respect is precisely what Goffman is talking about. The same emotion, the same concept governs how you present yourself towards other people and how you're looking for others' validation of that self-presentation, but also how you respond to their self-presentation in interaction with you. So it's much more explicitly interactive. You'd have to go back and live in Athens and have a sense of what it was like to really answer your question adequately. I don't think any of us is capable of doing that. We just don't have the amount of evidence. So it really depends on your own orientation as a researcher. So I think some people look for examples of violence, of conflict, of selfishness in ancient societies, in classical Athens, for example, and they find them. But that's not all there is there. And given, let's say, the Athenian law court speeches that we have from the 4th century BC, are these cases in which the occurrence of something bad was so egregious that someone felt they really had to do something about it? Or are the cases in which something ordinary was happening, something that happens again and again and again? And the number of speeches we have, and even the references they make to other scenarios and other circumstances, other events, is not sufficient really to allow us to specify those things. If you want to pin me down, I don't think they're any worse than us, and I think we have become Since I was a student, for example, matriculating in 1979, I think we've become a lot more selfish than we were then.
Thank you so much for your talk. I still keep thinking about the exact notion of time. And I have to admit that at the end I got a little bit confused about what it can actually mean, and perhaps please forgive me if I don't get things right. So I was thinking about the Romans, and in the Roman sources the authors distinguish between internal moral worth, like honestas, and the public recognition, like existimatio or gloria or something like this. So would this also be or could time also comprise this differentiation? And the second question I have is, in Latin, honor also means the public office.
Yeah.
And what's the Greek equivalent to the institutionalized honor?
Yeah, and so time also means public office in Greek. So the archi of the Athenian state are also called timai. But my point about them is that they, like honores in Roman culture, those are about positions that you can exercise, roles that you perform. It's true that getting one puts you on some kind of level that's differentiated from others. And so they are marks of respect, marks of esteem, but they're also claims to respect and claims to esteem, and they're performative. They involve the enactment of roles. So that is similar. Greeks, of course, do thematize the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic values. So they do thematize the difference between self-respect and the respect that you receive from other people. And in fact, the kind of thing you find in Cicero along those lines, as Margaret Graver has shown, is very much taken from from Greek Stoicism into Roman Stoicism. So people like Democritus, for example, can talk about feeling shame before yourself or feeling respect before yourself as a way of differentiating that as a motive from simply being concerned about what other people say about you. Notoriously, you've got the whole problem in 5th and 4th century Greek sources of doing wrong in secret. So if we could get away with it, if we never got caught, would we just go and do all the bad stuff? Or is there some intrinsic reason for us not doing all the bad stuff? And of course, the answer of people like Plato, people like Protagoras, people even like Antiphon the Sophist, is that no, we don't. So we don't behave completely opportunistically. We're not entirely heteronymous in our orientation. There are some things we wouldn't do even if we thought we could get away with them. So if you gave us Gyges' ring, it's not the case that we would do all the worst crimes that we can think of. What was your first point was, yeah, so the idea that timai can be subjective in nature rather than objective, so they're not the things you get from other people, they're the things that give you the claim to get those things from other people. That, I think, is very clear in Hesiod's Theogony, if you know that. So the story there is that Zeus establishes his regime, his control, and what he then does is parcel out timai to the other gods. And those timai then give them claims to be recognized as the god who does X by human beings. So the timai there isn't primarily the recognition of the claim on the part of others, those who owe the respect. It's the claim itself. It's the prerogative. It's the role. It's the claim. I don't, on my limited acquaintance of the terminology in Latin, I don't think it's quite that way in Latin. Although, so there's Jacques Coté, the guy who wrote the book on Onos and Honestum, French volume. He does thematize the kind of thing you're talking about. But if you look slightly away from the terminology of onos and honores towards things like verecundia, for example, or decus and decorum, then you get very much the picture that I've been trying to outline with regard to Greek honor or Greek eidos. So Bob Castor in his book on emotion, restraint, and community in classical Rome, points out that verecundia works very much like eidos. It's a way of mutually monitoring self and other in interaction. Your verecundia, great paper also by Cynthia Damon on this, about Cicero's letters, in the volume on valuing others in antiquity. She points out that Cicero is always monitoring how he's doing, and he's monitoring how other people think he's doing, but he can't be too insistent in saying, how do you think I'm doing? Because that would violate their face as well. That would be face-threatening towards them. So you can't just say, what do you think about me all the time? Sometimes you have to say, how are you doing?
Many, many thanks for this wonderful panorama which you have given to us. What I was wondering a little bit is about historical development even within Greek society. Would you agree that, and this is sort of my impression, that at least in Homer and Hesiod, as you have mentioned it, sort of Timē is probably a little bit more extrinsic than it could become later, in particular also in a philosophical context. Because of course the Timē of an Agamemnon and of an Achilles is really also based in a large, to a large extent on the soldiers, the number of soldiers which they have. Of course, the more soldiers you have, and the more money you have in a way also, the more Timē you have the right to ask to be given. And therefore it is really sort of quite external at this moment. And I would say even the same thing which you already said now for Hesiod in a way. And of course this remains important. It is a basic term also in Thucydides for politics in general. That he says it's fear, it's also advantage, but it's also honor. And in this context of honor, probably it remains also a little bit more externalized than later on in philosophical discussions, where it becomes really sort of an intrinsic value. I was during your talk even looking to the Declaration of the Human Rights, and there you have also an honor and reputation which everybody has in a way, which of course is always interactive, even if it is tied back to the individual, but still. But would you agree that there is within the Greek society, however, sort of a historical development?
I think there's a historical development. I think the development is in the actual... So Timē is the ancient Greek word for value, or if you like, the ancient Greek word for price. They don't seem to distinguish in its usage between price and value. So price is basically what I'm prepared to pay for the item, how I value it. Value can be the value placed on it by the seller, or the value that's intrinsic to it by virtue, let's say, of its labor value or something like that. So the value can be intrinsic to the object or conferred upon the object. But in fact, there's always an interaction between those two things. And Timē just does mean value. So there are lots of quasi-economic senses in Homer. What changes, I think, is what people value. That's inevitably and very obviously the case. So the types of society, the types of achievement, the types of character, the forms of arete and so on, those change greatly over time. And I used to think along the same lines as you've just formulated about Homer too. So I came to Homer, I think, when I first started my PhD in 1983, thinking that, you know, the Finlayan view was right. So honor resided in external goods. So that's the reason why when you kill somebody, you've got to take their armor to prove that you've done it. And therefore, the actual material value of the object and the symbolic value of the object are bound up together and all of that. And it wasn't until this project, so far too late, that I actually looked at how the terms Timē and Timan and Atimazdo and so on, and Atimos and so on are used in Homer. And guess what I find? That the overwhelming majority, by far, you know, up towards 80-90% of cases of these terms refer to recognition respect. So I had thought, for example, that in the quarrel of Achilles and Agamemnon, it's all about how they want to be esteemed in terms of appraisal respect in the eyes of their fellows. So Achilles gets so upset because a mark of esteem has been taken away from him. And Agamemnon takes his mark of esteem away from him because he himself has lost a mark of esteem. And so they've lost visible proof of their standing in the eyes of the community. They've lost appraisal respect. And yet when Agamemnon takes Briseis from Achilles, he's insulting him. So Achilles immediately says it's an idea and it's hubris. And it's then not so much about competition between these two individuals to be considered the best of the Achaeans. It's also about the fact that they had a kind of agreement. So Achilles came on the basis that if he fought well, he would get esteem or appraisal respect for fighting. When he's denied that promise, denied that reward, then a claim that he had to be validated has been denied. It's about also recognition and respect. And overwhelmingly, if you think of the suitors and the Odyssey as well, it's exactly the same thing. What seems to concern these people is not so much the constant pursuit of greater esteem in the eyes of their fellows, although they are concerned for that too. So not just the competitive thing, but also the loss of the marks of esteem and the recognition to which they feel they're entitled. So one of the things that the book by Brennan and Pettit that I mentioned predicts is that if esteem is like a kind of commodity which people value in society, then it will mean more in terms of loss to those who have a lot of it, and mean more in terms of acquisition to those who have none of it. And none of the people in the Iliad that we're dealing with are those who are have-nots. They're all haves. So what Achilles and Agamemnon are most concerned about, in spite of all the recognition they enjoy and all the esteem they have, is losing just a little bit of it. Whereas someone at the bottom of the pile might be prepared to do very risky things in order to make their mark and be recognized. So that, I think, is a fairly constant mechanism between Homeric society and Athenian society, different though they definitely are. So the values they espouse are different, but the mechanisms are, I think, the same. And what I'm really trying to persuade you of is not constancy of values from Homer to, let's say, Plutarch and beyond, but constancy of mechanisms. The mechanisms remain the same.
Thank you very much. I was wondering about the social differences and borders. When we say that a person is concerned, should show respect to the others and is concerned with the respect the other people show to him. So about which groups do we say? Because there are women, there are slaves and barbarians. Do they also, should we also show, is it about aristocrats in Athens who sit in the symposium and it's their opinion which one cares about, or so? Could you say something about that?
Well, there's more or less, so there are matters of degree. And Greeks talk all the time about who has more honor and who has less. And sometimes that's about rank, and sometimes it's simply about other forms, less hard and fast, less rigid forms of social stratification and distinction. So clearly there are forms of rank, and responding to rank is a kind of recognition and respect. If you think, well, in fact, according to Darwell, responding to someone powerful is always a form of recognition and respect. You have to factor into your deliberations the fact that this person is powerful. You just can't ignore it. It would be imprudent to ignore it. So Darwell allows that to be recognition and respect, but he also allows forms of social status and rank to count as recognition and respect. And it just is considered improper in a society, and it's certainly imprudent in most societies to fail to accord respect to those who believe they have a claim for it and those whose claims are endorsed by the rest of society. To get to your point, these things are very asymmetrical. So people are more concerned about their own claims than they are about the claims of others. So the burden of our book on hubris, which is coming out next week, is about the forms that asymmetry takes. And the point of the comparison between ancient and modern hubris in that volume is that ancient hubris exhibits asymmetrical, egocentric biases that are still very apparent in modern society. So we just do care more about how we ourselves come across than we do about how other people are coming across. The fundamental attribution error is a good example of that. So if I stand on someone's foot in the tram, I will expect them to acknowledge that it was an accident, that that's not the kind of person I am, that I do in fact care about other people. If someone else stands on my foot in the tram, I'll assume that they're a bad person, they did it deliberately. And that's just the way it is. So we take our own shortcomings as localized, as situationally conditioned, and as atypical, whereas we take other people's faults as part of their character. Hubris is kind of like that as well. So hubris is very asymmetrical. Hubris is basically what you do to me. It's very rarely what I do to you. So when that comes in contact with rank, you get people who are very insistent on their own dignity, who care much less about the dignity of others. And so it's clear that Athenians, for example, thought a lot about the respect that they thought they deserved from slaves, but they thought very little about the respect that slaves might deserve. So there is a view there that slavery on the Athenian model is a form of dehumanization, that it turns people into non-persons, inflicts a form of social death, and completely alienates those people from any form of honor. We have another book that came out earlier this year, Slavery and Honor in Classical Athens, which argues that that's not in fact the case. We argue partly on a Hegelian basis that if you want to be recognized by someone, you are intrinsically, implicitly recognizing that person. So the master is recognizing the slave in demanding that the slave recognizes him, but it's not just a theoretical point. In practice in Athens, masters couldn't possibly always be coercing their slaves to do absolutely everything that the slaves had to do. So sometimes they had to trust them. And the only way to trust them is to build up some kind of relationship. Now, these relationships were exploitative, they were abusive, they were asymmetrical, but they still involved the exchange of goods and services and not just taking. So Xenophon, for example, says, if you want your slaves in the Oikonomicus, or Ischomicus rather says than the Oikonomicus, if you want your slaves to behave well, treat them like kaloi kagathoi. Honor them, he says. And although that's very idealistic, let's say, or perhaps very unrealistic, it's clear that it was possible, while being an enslaved person in Athenian society, nonetheless to be involved in mutual relationships of exchange of benefits, in which if you performed well, you had an expectation that you would be rewarded. So you know the Lesis tablet. Where are the religion historian people here? Lesis is a guy who sometime in the 5th century wrote on a lead tablet that he'd been lent out to a master who was abusing him. And he was being treated very, very badly. And he writes to his mother and someone else, we don't know who the someone else is, and says, get me out of here. This guy is treating me really, really badly. I don't deserve this. If you can say that you don't deserve it, then you are stating a claim to be treated a certain way in the context of a certain relationship. There are legitimate and illegitimate ways of treating these people. And that seems to be the way that the Athenians thought of it. So, am I going on too long on this question? One final point. In Demosthenes 21 against Midias, and in Aeschines 1 against Timarchus, they point to the Athenian law of hubris, which says that you cannot and should not commit hubris against a slave. And they say, well, of course, that doesn't mean that slaves have honor. But actually, that is exactly what it means. So they try and explain it away. They say it's not about honor, it's not about, we would say rights, but that's what they're talking about in terms of time. It's about philanthropia. But if you can have an attitude towards a slave that you can call philanthropia, and if you can recognize that insofar as a slave is an anthropos, they are capable of being a victim of hubris, then you are according some kind of right, minimal rights to that slave. So I think, to answer your question very succinctly, it's very hard to exclude absolutely, to absolutely, totally exclude anyone in a society from having a claim to esteem.
Maybe two very short questions. Is okay? Or you want?
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I have one question about how can you restore honor, and in relation with the honor killing, when someone kills someone, because and do we have out in the ancient Greek texts we have so the protagonists restore their honor, and if we have honor killing also in Greek societies, and how is the dynamic behind this? But maybe it's a long question. So.
You do have what we might call honor killing. So we have killing and revenge. But of course, in the classical Greek polis, you're not supposed to kill people in revenge. It did happen, and clearly, you know, we hear of cases in which it's said to have happened. But the correct way to pursue someone who has, for example, murdered a member of your family is to take them to court. And this is a duty of the individual, not of the state. So it's still a familial duty, it's still a personal obligation to pursue what they call timoria, which is kind of the operative concept in honor killing. You're wanting something back that's been lost. You want the restoration of something that you believe you've lost. But you do that through legal and civic methods, ideally, rather than through... So someone who did, for example, engage in an honor killing in classical Athens would have been liable to prosecution by the relatives of the person they'd killed. So it wouldn't be accepted in the way that it's sometimes still accepted in Hindu or some Muslim societies. When you want to see your honor restored, what do? Well, let's go back all the way to the beginning. And again, it's about homicide. So in a speech that the hero Ajax gives to Achilles in Iliad 9, he says, now look, he's offering compensation, Agamemnon's offering compensation for the offense, the insult he offered in Book 1. Even someone who's lost a relative, a brother, let's say, or a son, even such a person accepts compensation and doesn't carry on a feud. So there's an ideal there that feuding is not the best way to resolve things. And that ideal is then represented as a picture of what a civilized society looks like on the shield of Achilles in Iliad 18. So there's a trial there, which is about someone who's had a relative killed, but they are pursuing not violent vengeance, violent retaliation. They're pursuing some kind of reconciliation. And if you think of what happens with Achilles and Agamemnon, that's precisely what happens. So Agamemnon, first of all, offers, well, let's say, you know, the son. He offers everything. He offers vast amounts of stuff. You know, women, tripods, gold. He wants to make Achilles his son-in-law. He's going to give him land when they get back to Greece and all this kind of stuff. And Achilles says no. He says, shameless though this man is, he wouldn't come here and face me. I will not return to battle until he pays back the insult. So giving him lots of stuff somehow doesn't pay back the insult. What happens? Well, in one sense, he no longer cares that much about the insult when Patroclus has been killed. But in another sense, he then becomes happy with Agamemnon accepting that he is a suitable cooperator, and he accepts Agamemnon as a suitable cooperator because Agamemnon says, it wasn't really me. I'm not responsible. Nobody believes him. Everybody knows it was him. Everybody knows he's responsible. But in public, he's saying, I'm not that kind of guy. That's not how I really am. It's just face-saving. It's just for public consumption. But Achilles at that stage wants to reconcile. And so he accepts it. And he says, yeah, you're right. It must have been Zeus. It wasn't you at all. But nobody believes that. And in fact, you can see nobody believes it because after all this has been said, Odysseus says to Agamemnon, don't do it again. Be more just in future. He's recognizing that Agamemnon was responsible for what he did. He has to answer for what he did. He has to offer reparation for what he did. It's not Zeus or Ate or the Moira who walks on air or anything like that. It was him. But now we need to get on with the serious business of fighting this war. We need to reconcile. So say something that works, and that's what they do. So reconciliation is clearly being regarded there as better than vengeance, better than continued vengeance.
Thanks, Douglas, for this wonderful talk. Just a very short question. We all know this very touching scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus meets Achilles in the underworld.
Yeah.
There, Achilles says, "Oh, it's nothing what I had on what I have here. I would like to be the last slave in the mill and working in the mill without any glory, any honor, nothing of all these things which counted in my earthly existence." This blows up the whole system of heroism in Homer.
Yep.
And I was wondering what causes or what reaction triggers that to an Athenian reader of the Athenian society you describe, with a time and with a very orderly, systematized values of honor.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I can answer it. What would an Athenian have thought? I think they would probably have thought what people seem to think elsewhere in the Odyssey and also in the Iliad, is that life at any cost is not, in fact, preferable to honor. So there are ways of losing your life which are worth it if they maintain your honor. That's clearly what Achilles thinks in the Iliad. So both Achilles and then ultimately Hector too put their lives on the line for the sake of the honor that they believe. Well, in fact, in Hector's case, it's duty, let's face it, isn't it? So he realizes he's failed his people. So whereas in Book 6 of the Iliad, he's concerned about people saying he might be a coward, what he's concerned about in Book 22 is people saying that he has failed as a leader and let his people down. And he doesn't want that to be his epitaph. And so he wants to leave some kind of different legacy behind. Does Achilles mean it in Odyssey 11? One thing that makes me think he doesn't quite mean it. I still don't know why he says it, but I think he doesn't quite mean it. And that's the fact that after all that is said, he then says, "How's my son?" And Odysseus says, "Oh, he's great. In fact, he was the guy that captured Troy. We couldn't have done it without him." And then it said, the last thing we see about Achilles in Odyssey 11 is that he strides off through the meadows of Asphodel with big strides, rejoicing that his son is renowned. So there's a kind of familiar honor there. There's a kind of persistence of Achilles' social identity through time that is validated by the success of his son. So he does kind of still care about honor, in spite of saying that he didn't. I think probably it's characterization. It's that what's being represented in that speech of Achilles to Odysseus in Odyssey 11 is the kind of thing that Achilles says in Iliad 9. Why do we do these things? Why do we fight? Why am I here? What's in it for me? But that's not his last word on the subject in the Iliad, and it's not even his last word on the subject in the Odyssey. So again, pluralism and different points of view and balancing one against the other would be what I would say in response.
Thank you all so much. I think the vivid discussion has shown that this is quite a fascinating topic, so it's time to thank you again, and thanks to everyone who came here. So,
thank you all. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, and have a good evening.